Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Procurement. And I really can't believe that it's the end of August already. And next week is actually going to mark the 1-year anniversary of when I decided to jump off that cliff and leave the confines of what was a really comfortable job and embark on this entrepreneurial adventure. And it's been a pretty crazy year. I read a lot before I started about it being a roller coaster, and I thought, maybe that's a little bit cliche. It's not going to be like that for me. Well, absolutely it was like that for me. But saying it's a roller coaster is probably putting it mildly. But I think that my first year, probably the subject of another show, but it's actually somewhat relevant when it comes to the topic of conversation today. Because in my interview today, I talked with Tom Greco and Ed Edwards, both of ThomasNet. And if you haven't heard of ThomasNet before, they're a product sourcing and supplier discovery platform. You might have heard of them previously by their old name, which was the Thomas Register of American Manufacturers. And Tom is the Vice President of Publishing Operations, while Ed is the Manager of Audience Outreach. And in today's conversation, we talked about working with small and medium-sized businesses, and you'll hear me use the term SMBs. We actually look at both sides of the table, so the side of the table for a procurement organization and the SMB itself. So first, I shared a number of the fears that I had as a buyer in working with SMBs. And Tom and Ed, well, they talk about how I could have negated some of those fears and also provide a number of areas where perhaps using an SMB might actually be more beneficial than their larger competitors. An example of that may be in innovation. And then we shift focus and dive into the fears that an SMB might have in working with larger organizations and working with procurement. And we discuss what we can do as procurement to help allay some of those concerns. All right, well, before we roll the tape, I'm going to share details of today's sponsor. And without my sponsors, really today's episode wouldn't be possible. So I'm very thankful for that. And then I'm going to go straight into the interview. Today's episode of The Art of Procurement is brought to you by Zycus Horizon 2016. And Horizon is an annual conference hosted by Zycus. Zycus is a leading provider of a complete suite of source-to-pay procurement performance solutions. And their 2016 Horizon event is a 3-day get-together of some of the most leading minds in the procurement space, where everybody gets together and shares and solves their most critical challenges with their peers. The event itself is taking place in Arizona. And I'm thrilled that the Art of Procurement will be a media partner for Horizon, and I'm actually going to be hosting a main stage panel discussion as part of the event. So to find out more, visit artofprocurement.com/horizon. That's artofprocurement.com/horizon. Hi there, and welcome to another Art of Procurement Tuesday interview show. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm joined today by Tom Greco and Ed Edwards of ThomasNet. So Tom, Ed, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Philip. Great to be here.
Thanks. And for some context, in today's show, I wanted to actually further the discussion that I started on the Art of Procurement, and it was way back in episode 26, I think. And I talked with Stan Leitow, who is president of IBM Foundation. And we talked about procurement's role in facilitating small business growth. And that was more of from a corporate responsibility perspective. So what I wanted to do today was switch from looking at using small businesses as corporate responsibility to it being much more of a business imperative and kind of exploring why we really should be thinking and using small businesses as a procurement function. So I do have a bunch of questions for Tom and Ed on the topic. And I also want to go a little bit into the fact that as a practitioner, I was really hesitant to source small and medium-sized businesses, or SMBs. And so I wanted to kind of cover some of the apprehensions I had, because I'm sure that listeners to the show have some of those same concerns as well. So with all that in mind, my first question, and I'll leave it open to whoever wants to jump in first, is as a buyer or as a procurement leader, why should I be interested in engaging with SMBs?
Well, Philip, this is Ed. I'm going to talk to this point briefly. SMBs can bring a lot of advantages to the table that are important and should be important to buyers generally. Certainly in manufacturing, for instance, because they're so prevalent geographically in the marketplace, you're going to have options in your local or regional area that are SMBs. So if you choose to work with an SMB, that can bring along the advantages of local regional sourcing, things such as shorter lead times, reduced shipping costs, and faster responsiveness to any type of unanticipated needs that may come up. The other point I want to make here is that they also represent a potential path to cost savings. When you survey large buying organizations and ask them why are they reaching out for new sources of supply, one of the top responses is always the need to reduce costs.
Right.
SMBs tend to have lower overhead, which can translate into lower direct costs when that's passed on to the buy side. And finally, another reason is they can be very nimble and agile to work with, which can be valuable when you're trying to partner with an SMB, more so to develop a solution rather than just to buy a product.
I actually just want to ask a question on, you mentioned cost savings and the ability to reduce costs, and I think it's an important point that you made, that it's because they have an inherently lower cost structure rather than the fact that you have a greater power in the relationship. Because obviously that's something that may be the case, but something that we don't really want to go down that route because that's not building great relationships.
Right. It's more the cost structure. The cost structure being, of course, that there are fewer layers of management. There's less infrastructure in many cases. So the overhead costs are lower.
Right.
Also, if you look at information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you're going to discover that typically there's a strong correlation between the size of an organization and the average labor cost associated with it. Mm-hmm. So as you get to be a larger organization, there's also higher direct salary costs that enter into it as well.
And so when I think about SMBs, and I mentioned this a little bit in my introduction, when I was a buyer, I was kind of hesitant because I would always look at it from a risk perspective, or a perceived risk perspective, and also, the old adage that nobody gets fired for hiring IBM. So I wondered if you could just kind of answer a few or respond to a few of the concerns that I would have, because I'm sure that listeners to the show will have some of those concerns, and where you've seen examples of companies kind of mitigating that risk or understanding the risk a little bit more. And the first one was that I was always afraid that an SMB wouldn't have financial stability to support any changing needs that I might have, and that they may become too reliant on me. I wondered if that's something that you see in reality.
Well, this is Tom. The question of an SMB becoming reliant on one customer, I think, is a real one, and in picking an SMB to work with, it is certainly something that the buyer should be concerned with. So I do agree with that point. On the other hand, as it relates to financial stability, there are countless SMBs who are financially stable, and they should be evaluated like any other larger organization. In fact, thomasnet.com, as you might know, is a database of suppliers in the industrial manufacturing commercial space, and we recently had opportunity to take a look at the financial ratings of the suppliers in our database, and you'd be surprised to know that the majority are financially stable. Right. And as a case in point, thomasnet.com is a 120-year-old medium-sized business that is been very financially stable. Yeah. So I think that's a preconceived notion that we need to leave at the door.
Yeah, and just to build on what Tom said here, Philip, I had the pleasure of presenting at ISM recently, where we talked to this very topic with Natalie Menke, who's the president of another SMB in Indiana. She told me a few of her golden rules that she uses when she's dealing with larger organizations. Number one, she never changes her business for any one customer. And number two, she never has more than 30% of her business coming from any one customer. So by implementing these kinds of rules, as Tom was mentioning, a lot of SMBs have figured out that they have to be a little bit careful with how they manage opportunities from larger organizations. Yeah. But they certainly are willing to do that and maintain financial stability.
Do you find that SMBs are typically open to share financial information, obviously under the cover of an NDA, when they're requested to by larger buying organizations, just to help allay some of those fears?
Well, I think they're willing to do it, and one of the things that we've discovered, though, is it's often the timing of when it's asked that's the more important point. You know, we could get into this later, I'm sure, but one of the challenges, of course, is the perception that SMBs have about larger buying organizations, and in particular the sourcing process that they use.
Right.
If larger buying orgs just go in and routinely throw out questionnaires right at the initial point of first contact and ask questions about things such as financial stability and assets and those working capital and things of that nature, before they're even really engaged with that supplier in understanding the particular challenge or issue that's trying to be solved, that can really be more of a turnoff to the SMB from engaging with that potential opportunity.
Yeah, if the SMB feels that it is a real opportunity that they're vying for, they're typically more than happy to share their financial information.
But don't be lazy and ask for it all up front before you've even started to build a relationship with that supplier.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the next fear that I always had, and this was more, I guess, coming from a financial services industry, because I was in financial services for a while, was that we had a lot of stringent risk assessment processes. And, you know, including looking at insurance, not having business continuity, disaster recovery plans. I wondered, again, if that's something that is something to be afraid of, or, again, whether that was just a perception I had without it necessarily being grounded in reality.
Well, I mean, again, evaluating any supplier, big or small, those are things that should be looked into, whether they have enough insurance coverage, asking what would happen in a disaster. I mean, it even gets into questions around Tier 2, right? Yeah. Where do you get your core supplies to make that component part you're making for me? So to me, small or large, the question is the same. And, you know, there's a reverse opinion on this. You know, smaller organizations who have half dozen, a dozen key clients, they have a stronger incentive when there's a crisis to take care of their key clients than a larger organization who may be left to scramble for hundreds of clients. So, you know, again, like the first question, I think it cuts both ways.
Yeah, and this is Ed again, just to kind of build on what Tom mentioned here. You know, there's always a trade-off that exists when you're doing sourcing. You know, you can't optimize on every particular parameter. Risk is certainly one element that you're looking at, but, you know, cost savings is another. The innovativeness of the supplier and the solution that they provide is another. So you have to be willing to engage with that supplier, whether they're larger or smaller, and sort of weigh these various elements in making a procurement decision. So it isn't just a one-sided decision. There's a lot of facets to it that need to be considered.
Right. So the next concern is that I always feared that there would be a lot more kind of hand-holding of a small or medium-sized business through the process, and I want to say that it was because I was always, you know, working at 120% capacity, and sometimes it was probably because I was a little bit more lazy. Do procurement organizations need to invest more time in nurturing an SMB through the process because they may not be familiar with it? Or again, is that just me with my big company hat on, thinking that it's only other big companies that really know how to work with procurement?
Well, I think SMBs do, in some instances, require a little bit of additional energy or effort on the part of the buying organization to deal with. But there's a benefit that comes out of that engagement, too. And a lot of times that benefit can be things such as improved performance that you get from working with that supplier. And as a result of that, you're able to turn that around and go to your end customer with a better product, which makes you more competitive. So again, it's one of these cases where I don't necessarily view, you know, leveraging an SMB as considering them as an extra supplier. I more view it as being an integral supplier to your supply chain and your overall delivery of your end product to your customer. So a lot of, as you know, Philip, over time there's been a great shift away from larger organizations maintaining capacity in every area in a full suite of manufacturing. So many things are being outsourced now, and many of those outsourced opportunities, by definition, fall right centrally into small to mid-sized businesses. Mm-hmm. So they're really an integral part of any kind of supply chain these days. It's really not something you can just turn a blind eye to and say, hey, let's go and get this from IBM, as you said before.
Right. And importantly, on the indirect side as well. So it's not necessarily just limited to the manufacturing space. There's a lot of very niche providers who do very specific things, but they do them extremely well. On the services side, that it makes sense to investigate and explore rather than just going to an established name because of the brand that's associated with it.
Agreed.
And I know I've been playing devil's advocate here, but from my personal experience is that I've always had a lot of good experience working with small businesses, because one of the things that you mentioned before is I looked at it from an agility perspective. So you really feel as though sometimes, you're going in, and this is both in manufacturing and in services, sometimes you go in and you're not necessarily sure exactly what you need to buy, but you understand the function that it needs to perform. And that can be a service, it can be a component. And I always found that smaller organizations were much more flexible in terms of being able to craft something that exactly meets your requirements, as opposed to saying, well, this is our off-the-shelf product, this is our off-the-shelf service, and it either works for you or it doesn't work for you. So I've only got positive things to say about working with small businesses and medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, and my experience has been very much similar to what you just described, mm-hmm. Philip, that generally I've found them to be very responsive, to bring a lot of expertise to situations where, a larger organization may not necessarily be able or willing to devote the resources to.
Right.
So it's many times much easier to get answers out of them and to get things done on a timely basis.
Yeah, that's particularly true if you're able to convey to that SMB what you're trying to accomplish with your product.
Right.
So if you need a particular component, what are you trying to optimize? And they can often recommend a different approach, a different solution than was spec'd out even by your own engineering team, because they don't really have, as Ed mentioned, expertise in that particular area.
Yeah, innovation really is where it's key as well, I think, from small businesses, because larger organizations, maybe they have bigger R&D budgets, but they're a little bit slower generally to innovate, I think. And also because there's the risk of innovations cannibalizing some of their existing products and their services, whereas a lot of small and medium-sized businesses, that's kind of their business, is they have to do that to survive. Or they're a small and medium-sized business because they're a startup, because they're bringing something that's innovative to market. So that's the other way that I would always look at SMBs, is are they able to bring something different or have a different product roadmap from an established larger company that, I can grow with.
Yeah, and you're familiar, Philip, with a lot of them, as we are. And many of these small to mid-sized businesses were formed by folks who left a larger organization right. because they saw a need or they saw a niche that they could carve out, and they couldn't get response from their own internal management to help solve problems. So they decided to just do it on their own, mm-hmm. Take the entrepreneurial spirit and solve that problem through establishing a business of their own.
And so if I switch to the perspective of the small business, it's funny, as procurement, we typically just look at things through our own lens, and I know I always did, especially when you're a large company and kind of think that I'm a large company, everybody wants to work with me. And I'm not sure if that's always the case now that I've been on the small business side. I've had experience with large companies coming and asking for RFPs for things that just the way they ask for them means that there's no real flexibility for me to show exactly what I can do. And, I feel like it's just they're trying to get my pricing to beat up a larger incumbent. The SMBs that you talk to, do they want to work with large organizations, or is it just more hassle? Do there have to be a set of circumstances that are present that really motivates them to want to work with a larger organization?
This is Tom again. It's not that they don't want to work with large buying organizations. It's that they're turned off typically by the process that many large buying organizations employ. Mm-hmm. So when they're approached, in a bureaucratic way, as Ed mentioned, with a 80-page questionnaire,
Right.
20 pages of which don't apply to the particular situation, they're turned off. And there's a high percentage of them that when they're approached in that manner, want nothing to do with that situation, and they will not engage.
Yeah, I guess they don't even have the resources to be able to complete that, because it's not like they have people sitting around on the bench or huge organizations of people who are there just to respond to RFPs. It's probably going to be taking somebody away from the management of the business to respond to this thing.
Yeah, and Natalie Menke, who I mentioned earlier, brought this out to us as well, is that, again, it's owner-operator, owner-proprietor type business where, as you say, the bench isn't very deep. When I'm not running the financial side of the business, I'm down on the shop floor helping to solve problems, or I'm on the phone with my suppliers helping to negotiate, better pricing. So I've got a lot of hats that I'm wearing, and I don't have the time really or the ability to respond to everything that comes across my desk in terms of new business opportunities. So by necessity, I've got to be a bit, particular about what I choose, and I have to be able to try to weigh or assess whether this is a real opportunity that I think I can capture the business on to justify devoting the resources to it.
Yeah.
And as Tom alluded to before in terms of the process, when the larger buying organization insists on following standardized processes where they just throw out questionnaires and there's very much a disconnect in terms of a real human that you can reach out to, all that tends to do is to just reinforce the fact that it's difficult for them to assess whether this is going to be an opportunity that they can capture.
Right.
So it tends to turn them off.
And how about what's the confidence level that they're even really in the running to get the business, or they're just there to make up so that a buying organization knows that they're probably going to be cheaper pricing and they can just wave that in front of a larger supplier that they might want to use?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the buying organizations need to think about is being more transparent and sharing, for instance, that very point. Mm-hmm. What's the motivation for why I'm seeking a new source of supply? Is this simply a pricing issue where I need to bring down pricing, and in which case the SMB then knows that, hey, the only thing I need to concern myself with here is to try to give the best possible price I can for this situation? Or is it something entirely different? Is there a performance issue that needs to be solved? Or is there existing supplier who is non-responsive? Mm-hmm. So understanding what the motivators are for this particular sourcing event, that goes a long way to helping the SMB gauge whether this is an opportunity with which they wish to engage.
Right.
And that's one of the important differences here on getting responsiveness from the SMB.
It makes it real.
Yeah, it makes them feel as though they actually have a chance of winning this business or not. And why would they want to invest the time in something if there's a really low probability of succeeding?
Yeah, they have to gauge return on investment in terms of time versus potentially what they get out of it.
So what are some of the other perceptions that you hear from SMBs of dealing with big companies?
Well, besides the sort of long odds and the process, you mentioned it before, Philip, one concern is this whole idea of can I take on this business and can I fulfill it? Mm-hmm. So what's being asked of me in terms of this particular opportunity? How does that fit in with my existing lines of business that I have, the existing resources that I have? If I were to be successful, what would it mean to me in terms of devoting capacity in my organization to address the needs? So the whole question here becomes, am I biting off more than I can chew, so to speak? And that's really something that the SMB has to try to gauge. And it goes to what we mentioned a minute ago. The more that I know about what's being asked earlier in the procurement or the sourcing event process, the better I'm able to make that decision.
I think another concern of the SMB is long payment terms.
Right.
So there are a lot of large buying organizations these days who are enforcing on their suppliers or placing on them 60, 90, 120-day payment terms. And while there are many SMBs who are financially stable, paying them in 120 days can present liquidity and cash flow
Absolutely.
issues on a month-to-month basis. I think it's critical that the buying organizations work with their finance departments to make them understand that these long payment terms ultimately are compromising the supply chain folks' ability to meet their goals. Because 120 days, some of these SMBs, they won't even talk to you.
No, and I've back in the day, in fact, my early grounding in procurement was in automotive purchasing on the direct side, and I've seen that firsthand where you think nothing of pushing 60, 90, 120 day. There's even some companies who are pushing 180-day payment terms, and I mean that's a lot of cash to kind of make up, and a lot of in the cash flow. It's just not possible for a lot of companies, but as a large organization, you sometimes don't see that because you're just trying to push out kind of the directive of these are the payment terms we offer. It's kind of take it or leave it. Do you see flexibility from larger companies in payment terms when they want to work with a small business enough?
Well, we're starting to see some larger organizations adopt supply chain financing solutions where they can bring in a third-party financial institution that, based on the credit of the buying organization, the payments are advanced to the supplier on a timely basis, net a discount. So, we definitely recommend that if you want to take advantage of all that SMBs have to bring, that large buying orgs take a look at these supply chain finance solutions.
So when I think about how can we make life of an SMB easier, if it's somebody we really want to work with, we talked, I think, about the need to be transparent so that a small business can understand what it is that they're actually getting into and their odds of success. We talked about simplifying the process, so just making sure that this isn't too burdensome, that there's not even the ROI if they were to win the business of participating in the process, and also the payment terms. Is there anything else that we can do as a large company, as buyers, to really help at least facilitate the involvement of SMBs in the sourcing process?
Yeah, there is, Philip, and one of the things that we encourage buying organizations to do is what we call humanize the process.
Right.
This may seem strange in an era of increased communication efficiency, but one of the things that actually works is to, for instance, after you've issued a bid package to a group of suppliers, pick up the phone and call those companies. Let them know this is a real opportunity. We are genuinely interested in your inputs to this. This is a little bit about the package. Here's some important key contacts at our organization that you can reach out to if you have technical questions. Maybe it's a contact from engineering or a contact from operations. So providing some sort of human element into this process, it goes a long way to make the process real.
Right.
Tom mentioned before that sometimes they feel as though, it's not real. It's so static in terms of how it's treated that they can't get a sense that there's a real opportunity here. Sometimes just a human voice that they can talk to and a number that they can call will go a long way towards getting those SMBs to engage. So humanizing is really important. And, another element of it is giving feedback.
Yeah.
So if you find out that you're through a couple of steps of the process and you've got to reduce the number of bidders that you're dealing with and you've eliminated some of these suppliers, give them feedback. Let them know why they were eliminated. What were the criteria that caused them not to be considered in the final set of potential suppliers, because that's going to help them going forward as a supplier. They may need to take a look at how they represent themselves, whether it's on their website or through any other vehicles by which they market their products and services. So just that feedback that you can give really does a lot to help improve that relationship and to make sure that SMBs will be more reactive and more responsive to these types of opportunities.
And it increases the probability that if in 6 months or a year some other buyer includes that same supplier in a bid package, that they'll respond. They might be suitable for another opportunity.
Yeah, and when I think of it from my SMB experience, it's you don't mind so much putting the investment in building the bid if the worst case is you're going to get some really interesting and actionable intelligence in terms of how you go to market and your go-to-market strategy. And I never thought of that when I was a buyer. When I was a buyer, it was, okay, I'm going to take this down from 6 suppliers to 2 suppliers. I'll just shoot an email to 4 of them telling them, unfortunately, you haven't won it, and maybe there's a line saying why. But you never really invested too much time in the feedback. And when I'm on the other side of the table, that can make it worthwhile. Even not getting the bid is to understand where you are in the market and your go-to-market strategy. So I do think that's critical.
The only thing worse than not winning is, losing an opportunity and really not knowing why, or realizing that it was something that the buy side should have known much earlier in the process. Right. And I kind of felt as if I were dragged along to the 11th hour for reasons that should have been apparent much earlier in the process.
And that humanizing the process, we had a bid recently where the buyer was a large organization, and it was they'd controlled the process to the extent where you had a certain deadline which you could submit some questions, but you could talk to nobody. And again, as a buyer, that's something I understood because I'd done that before. But you don't realize the impact it has until you're on the other side, and that made us realize that if we can not even speak to the people who we're helping to solve the problem for, how are we really going to explain the differences between what we do and how we're unique as a small company versus something that a larger company will be able to do? So, that pretty much made us walk out of the process before it even started. And we thought the solution we had was probably more effective than any of the larger companies could deliver.
Yeah, very much the case. And again, Natalie Menke explained a couple of instances where she's had success, and one of the things that made her business be successful is she was able to work with the buy side in a capacity where she's really solving a problem, as opposed to being someone who's just providing a quote on some item that they already manufacture. So it's that distinction between, being a supplier partner where you're engaged with that buying organization in crafting a solution versus simply being someone who's there to provide a quote.
So I just have one last question before we wrap up. And we talked about the benefits of SMBs and large organizations partnering, but we did so, I think, largely in the context of a bid or an RFP. So what I was interested in is what have you seen large companies do well in terms of starting to build relationships with SMB in advance of a bid, as part of a category strategy, so that they've already kind of brought them into the fold, so that when a RFP comes up, you already understand a lot about them and you've already mitigated a lot of that risk in your mind, so that you're actually in a position where they've got a much bigger chance of being awarded the business.
Well, I can tell you a story from my background. Before I was with Thomas, I worked in engineering for about 14 years and with a large buying organization. And one of the things that we did when we worked with, small to mid-sized businesses, even before we knew we were going to reach out to them for a quote, we would approach them and bring them into the loop about what we were trying to do in terms of the potential problem that we're trying to solve. So there was one case where we had an SMB that we were considering to use as a source to provide a low noise amplifier for the receiver front end of a radar system that we were going to build, and we were hoping to win that bid. Now, we knew that there were a bunch of technical requirements that were going to be very critical for us, that were going to affect our ability to provide system performance, and we made the decision that we were going to work with this particular firm. They were local, first of all, so we could get to them within a half hour, 45 minutes. They had the product already developed, but it needed to be tweaked or adjusted for our needs. So we brought them into the fold very early in the process, before we even started developing our proposal, and we even gave them some development money to help them seed their development, and they were able to improve the performance, deliver us a prototype well in advance of when we were submitting our proposal, and as a result of that, we were able to improve our overall system performance numbers so that when we went to our customer with our bid, the combination of what our pricing was as well as our technical performance led us to be the preferred solution. So we won that opportunity in no short order because we were able to work very closely with that particular small to mid-sized business. So I think, if you're looking at it from the standpoint of what you can do, a lot of it is you've got to identify some critical components and critical suppliers, and you've got to reach out to them and work very closely with them as early as possible.
So during the design stage.
Exactly. This is design stage before we even get to a point where we're submitting a proposal to our customer. And as a result of being able to do that, we were able to win that opportunity.
Something that was really interesting to me that stood out when you were talking about that was the fact that you gave them some seed money. And I'm guessing it doesn't even need to be that much money in the grand scheme of things, but that shows a level of commitment that's far greater than even if it's, I'm pulling a number out of a hat, but $5,000, $10,000, it's something that's so immaterial. But that actually shows that you're willing to invest in the partnership, even though you're not at a stage where you're ready to buy from them.
Right, and they could tell that we were committed and that we were very interested in working with them to improve their product. And they got some things out of it too, obviously, because if they're improving the performance of their amplifiers, we're not the only customer in the world that they can sell to at that point. So they have a leg up on their competitors. So it made them a better supplier overall in terms of their financial picture and their place in the marketplace.
Well, Tom, Ed, we're coming to wrap up the show. So what I just wanted to do finally was ask if any listener is interested in learning a little bit more or reaching out to you, where's the best place for them to find you? And I'll link up to those in the show notes today.
You could reach out to us either through the ThomasNet site. You could email us directly, or find us on LinkedIn. We're both on LinkedIn. Okay. You could contact us directly through our LinkedIn profile. We'd love to be able to reach out to any of your listeners and provide any information that would help them in their dealings with small to mid-sized businesses.
And to learn about Thomas and ThomasNet, it's www.thomasnet.com.
Okay, great. Well, what I'll do is I'll link to thomasnet.com and I'll link to both of your LinkedIn profiles in the show notes. And those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/SMB. That's artofprocurement.com/SMB. So once again, Tom and Ed, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks very much, Philip. Great to be here with you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.